There are stretches of highway in Thailand where the GPS simply gives up, and the locals tell you to never, ever take a shortcut in the dark. That is exactly where tonight's story begins. Deep get into what happened out there in the dead of night. If you appreciate these deep dives into local mysteries, please take a quiet second to like the video. My friend Keat drives delivery trucks across the central provinces of Thailand, running a route that takes him from the sprawling outer rings of Bangkok up to the mountainous borders of Phetchabun. He handles the graveyard shift by choice, preferring the empty roads and the cool night air over the suffocating heat and gridlock of daytime. Traffic. He drives a standard 6-wheel commercial truck. Keat is a practical man, a driver who knows the hum of his engine better than he knows his own heartbeat. But there is one particular stretch of road in Lopburi that he will never drive. Again, not for double his salary, and not even if his job depended on it. It was a Tuesday night in late November, right at the end of the rainy season, when the air still holds a heavy, damp chill that seeps into the cabin of a vehicle no matter how high you turn up the heater. Keat was making good time on Highway 21, cruising through the flat agricultural landscapes. By day, Lopburi is famous for its endless fields of sunflowers. But by night, those same fields become vast oceans of black ink, swallowing the light from the headlamps and offering nothing but an oppressive, empty horizon. Around 2 a.m, Keat hit a dead stop. A massive, articulated lorry had jackknifed across the northbound lanes, and the local highway police had set up a haphazard detour using glowing orange cones. The detour directed all northbound traffic off the wide, safe asphalt of the main highway and on to a secondary provincial road. Keat sighed, downshifted, and followed the line of taillights into the dark. For the first 20 minutes, the detour was entirely normal. The secondary road was paved, albeit poorly maintained, with the familiar sights of rural Thailand passing by his windows. He saw closed noodle stands, the occasional glowing neon sign of a 24-hour convenience store, and small spirit houses adorned with wilting marigold garlands. But soon the line of traffic began to thin out. Cars turned off onto local routes, and other trucks seemed to vanish down unseen side roads, leaving Keat entirely alone on the dark tarmac. His GPS glowed with a pale blue light, showing a solid route that promised to loop him back onto Highway 21 in about 40 kilometers. Keat settled in, turning the radio down to a low murmur of traditional Luktung music, letting the rhythmic thud of his tires over the uneven road lull him into a state of focused calm. Then the GPS chimed. It instructed him to take a sharp left turn onto an unmarked road to save 30 minutes of travel time. Keat hesitated. The road looked incredibly narrow, flanked by dense walls of overgrown elephant grass. But the GPS line was solid, and the estimated time of arrival was tempting. He flicked his turn signal. The rhythmic clicking echoing loudly in the quiet cabin, and swung the heavy truck onto the new path. Almost immediately, the asphalt ended. The tires crunched onto packed red dirt, sending up a thick cloud of dust. Kiet frowned, easing his foot off the accelerator. The road was barely wide enough for his six-wheeler, and the dense canopy of ancient banyan trees quickly closed over the top of the truck, blocking out the faint light of the moon. The air conditioning in the cabin suddenly felt too cold, raising goosebumps on his forearms. But when he reached out to adjust the dial, he realized it was already turned down low. A profound sense of isolation began to settle over him. The radio dissolved into a harsh, crackling static. Kiet reached over and snapped it off, preferring the silence to the grating noise. But the silence that followed was wrong. It was too absolute. Anyone who has spent time in rural Thailand knows that the night is never truly quiet. There is always the deafening roar of cicadas, the distant barking of stray soy dogs, or the croaking of frogs. But outside the windows of Kiet's truck, there was nothing. It was a heavy, suffocating deadness, as if the forest had been vacuum sealed. The only sound was the low, steady rumble of his own diesel engine, and even that seemed muffled, swallowed by the dense trees pressing in on either side. He glanced at the GPS. The blue line had vanished. The screen simply showed his vehicle icon. The signal was completely gone. Mild annoyance began to curdle into creeping unease. He could not turn the truck around. The road was too narrow, and reversing for miles in the pitch black was out of the question. Dirt track eventually spilled out onto a paved road. He drove at a crawl, his high beams cutting through the floating red dust, illuminating the twisted roots and thick vines that lined the path. After what felt like hours, the trees suddenly broke. The road widened, opening up into a large, flat clearing. Kiet let out a breath he did not realize he was holding, expecting to see the familiar glow of a highway or a local gas station. Instead, he found himself at the edge of a village. But relief died in his throat before it could even form. There was something fundamentally wrong with the place. Kiet slowed the truck to a crawl, the heavy tires rolling silently over the packed earth. The village consisted of about 24 traditional Thai stilt houses, known as Bon Song Thai, arranged in a loose circle around a central dirt plaza. The houses were built entirely of dark, unvarnished teak wood, with steep gabled roofs that pointed sharply toward the starless sky. As Kiet looked closer, his unease deepened into a cold, paralyzing dread. There were no power lines connecting the houses. There were no satellite dishes bolted to the roofs, no blue PVC water pipes running up the stilts, no modern pickup trucks parked underneath the living quarters. There was not a single piece of plastic in sight. It was as if he had driven his truck straight
into a museum diorama. But the wood of the houses was heavily weathered, rotting at the edges and stained with years of dark moisture. The smell of the place seeped through the vents of the truck, a thick, cloying odor of damp earth, dried riverweed, and something faintly sweet, like old, decaying sandalwood. The absolute silence persisted. There were no dogs sleeping in the dirt. No soft glow of television screens flickering behind the wooden window shutters. The village was bathed in an unnatural, flat darkness, illuminated only by the harsh glare of Kiet's high beams. He wanted to press the accelerator to the floor and tear through the clearing, but the dirt road snaked tightly between the massive wooden stilts of the houses, forcing him to navigate at a painfully slow speed. As the truck crept deeper into the center of the village, the headlights swept across the lower level of a large house to his right. Kiet slammed his foot on the brake. The truck lurched to a halt, the engine idling with a low, nervous hum. Standing in the shadows beneath the house, perfectly still, were... Keith's heart hammered against his ribs. There were perhaps 5 or 6 figures standing between the thick teak pillars. They were dressed in traditional, rural clothing from a bygone era, simple, wrapped cotton garments that looked faded and stained with dark mud. But it was not their clothing that made Kiet's blood run cold. It was their posture. They were standing completely rigid, their arms hanging limply at their sides, their shoulders slumped at unnatural angles. They were all facing his truck, but they were not looking at him. Their heads were tilted slightly downward, their faces hidden in the deep shadows cast by the floorboards above them. Kiet swallowed hard, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He slowly eased his foot off the brake, letting the truck inch forward. As the angle of the headlights shifted, the beam of light washed directly over the figures. They did not flinch. They did not raise a hand to blind the blinding. Glare, they did not blink. Kiet stared in mounting horror as the light revealed their faces. Their skin was the color of old parchment, drawn tight over their cheekbones, and their eyes were wide open, reflecting the headlights with a dull, flat shine. They were not breathing. Kiet could see their chests, perfectly still beneath the thin cotton of their shirts. They were simply existing in the dark, frozen in time. Panic, pure and unalterated, finally broke through Kiet's paralysis. He hit the accelerator, desperate to get out of the clearing. But the moment he pressed the pedal, the truck's engine sputtered. It was a low, wet, coughing sound that sent a spike of pure ice straight through his chest. The heavy vehicle shuddered, the RPM needle dancing wildly on the dashboard, and the headlights flickered, dimming for a terrifying second before surging back to life. In that brief moment of darkness, the figures moved. Kiet gasped, slamming his back against the driver's seat. They had not walked toward him.
He had not heard a single footstep in the dirt, but when the lights returned, they were standing at the very edge of the road, mere feet from the passenger side door. More figures were emerging from the shadows of the other houses, stepping silently into the periphery of the headlights. They surrounded the truck, a silent crowd, their dead eyes fixed on the metal cabin. The smell of decaying sandalwood and wet earth became overpowering, filling the truck so completely that Kiet felt he was choking on it. He could hear his own ragged breathing echoing in the small space, contrasting violently with the absolute, impossible silence outside. He knew with a primal certainty that if the engine died completely, he would never leave this clearing. He would become another silent figure standing in the dark. He muttered a frantic, breathless prayer to whatever spirits might be listening, slammed the gear shift into first, and stomped the accelerator all the way to the floorboard. The engine screamed, a deafening roar that shattered the unnatural quiet of the village. The rear tires spun in the loose red dirt, kicking up a massive cloud of dust before finally catching traction. The heavy truck surged forward, tearing through the village. He kept his eyes locked dead ahead on the narrow dirt path leading back into the trees. The figures did not move to block his path, but as the truck barreled past them, Kiet saw from the corner of his eye that their heads were turning in unison, tracking his movement with slow, mechanical precision. The truck slammed into the tree line, the overgrown branches whipping violently against the windshield, sounding like hundreds of skeletal fingers trying to shatter the glass. Kiet drove with reckless desperation, bouncing over deep ruts and exposed roots, the suspension groaning under the strain. The dirt road stretched on forever, a dark maze designed to disorient and trap. The air in the cabin grew colder, the oppressive silence pressing against the windows despite the roaring engine. He kept checking his rearview mirror, terrified that he would see the pale figures standing in the red dust behind him, but there was nothing but swirling darkness. Just as he felt he could not take another second, the trees abruptly gave way. The truck burst out of the dense canopy, the red dirt instantly transitioning back to solid, smooth asphalt with a violent jolt. The heavy vehicle swirled wildly across the empty road before Kiet managed to wrestle it back under control, slamming on the brakes and skidding to a halt on the shoulder. He sat there, his chest heaving, his hands trembling so violently he could barely put the truck into park. He looked out the window. He was parked on the side of a wide, familiar provincial road. Above him, the sky was beginning to turn a soft, bruised purple with the approaching dawn. The radio, which had been silent for hours, suddenly crackled to life, filling the cabin with the cheerful, upbeat voice of a morning DJ. The GPS screen on the dashboard blinked, acquired a signal, and calmly announced that he was 20 kilometers from Highway 21. Kiet locked the doors and waited for the sun to rise completely before he put the truck back into gear. Walked over to a group of older local men who were sitting on a bench. Kiet politely interrupted them, describing the detour he had taken, the dirt road, and the isolated village with the dark teak houses. The men stopped talking. The oldest among them, a man with deep wrinkles and cloudy eyes, set his teacup down very slowly. He looked at Kiet with a mixture of pity and grave seriousness. The old man explained there was no village off that dirt road. There had not been a village there for over 100 years. During the reign of King Rama V, a devastating outbreak of cholera had swept through the region. To prevent the disease from spreading, one small isolated farming community deep in the woods had been entirely quarantined. The army had blockaded the only road in, forbidding anyone from leaving. The villagers were left to die in the dark, succumbing one by one to the sickness. When the last person finally passed, the authorities went in and burned the entire village to the ground to purify the land. The dirt road Kiet had taken was the old quarantine trail, a path that had officially been erased from all local maps decades ago. The old man leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper, and told Kiet that he was incredibly lucky his engine had not stalled completely, because the people in that village are still waiting for someone to take their place. His route that day handed the keys to his dispatcher and immediately requested a transfer to daytime deliveries. He still drives the highways of central Thailand, but he never takes the night shift. He never turns off the main road, and he never, ever trusts a shortcut.